What up, what up, what up? Welcome into another Green with Envy quick hit edition. As always, it's your boy Will Weir. How you doing? How you living? Joining me today, we have a special guest. This man decided to do a deep dive on my favorite childhood Celtic growing up, the one and only Antoine Walker. So as soon as I saw the article drop, I had to reach out. I had to get him on the show and had to talk to him about it a little bit more. Joining me today from Forbes magazine, SB Nation, it's Mat Issa. Matt, how you doing, brother?
Pretty great. I'm pretty great. I know you said Antoine Walker was your favorite player growing up, so you were coming around in the 2000s. Did you watch Entourage by any chance? TV show?
Man, it's so funny you say that. So, I obviously being from Boston, I grew up in Dorchester, same
Yeah.
area as Mark Wahlberg, who produced Entourage. And, Entourage was such a cultural phenomenon. I was one of the few. I mean, I've seen the show. I know enough about the show. Was never a huge fan of Entourage, despite everyone around me loving that show.
Interesting. The only reason I bring it up is because Jeremy Piven, the guy who plays Ari, the agent on Entourage, he has like a podcast now. It's like the funniest podcast name of all time. It's How You Livin', Jay Piven. And when you said How You Livin', I just was immediately reminded of that because I don't know, it's so silly.
Well, I gotta connect with Jeremy Piven. Then we gotta see if we're on the same wavelength. Then if we got the same sign on or something, we may have to have some copyright conversations about who came up with it first, see who got the stamp on it. But yeah, man. So growing up in Boston, I was born in '89, so I grew up mostly. I was thinking about this this morning before we hopped on. My childhood, right when I became really able to, fully understand what was happening in basketball was right after the Larry Bird era, right, with the Celtics. So it's a really grim section of Celtics basketball in the mid 90s. And, myself, one of our other co-hosts here, we're best friends. We grew up together. We always talk about it's amazing how much we love basketball going through the mid 90s Celtics. And it was really Antoine was the first kind of glimmer of hope that any 90s kid had growing up in Boston for knowing what good basketball looked like, besides the tales of what our fathers would tell us and what the uncles would say about the 80s Celtics and so on and so forth. So I'm really curious. I love the off season because it lets people kind of let their freak flag fly in a way, in a sense of just like exploring untouched topics, right? And so I'm curious, what drew you to doing a deeper dive into Antoine Walker's game?
Yeah, I mean, my goal is to I'm a young guy. I'm only 24, so I can't.
That's the
I
other
don't
part
think
that I
I've
was
looked.
very curious about. I know you didn't grow up with Antoine like I
Yeah,
did. So
no,
you
I
only
didn't.
caught probably the tail end of that career, which wasn't nearly as good as the beginning.
No. Um, but so I want to be like I'm aspiring NBA historian, right? I want to learn more about the game of history. So every off season, I've spent time working on little projects. And last off season, I worked on one with Rashard Lewis, and those Orlando Magic teams were famous for taking a lot of threes. Um, so I started looking at like 3-point attempt rate like by season of like all NBA teams, trying to see like which teams had like similar like outlier levels of 3-point rate relative to the teams they were competing against. So the teams that season, and there's a bunch of them, and I kept noticing like those early 2000s Boston Celtics were just taking a ton of threes like, under Pitino and under Jim O'Brien, and then I started I knew Patino kind of really emphasized the 3-point shot, but then I started looking into like Jim O'Brien's kind of like biography as a coach. Started seeing a trend of teams just taking more threes when he was their coach, and look at those Celtics teams and I see like how many threes Antoine Walker and Paul Pierce are taking, and I'm like, okay, just bookmark this. Whenever I have time, I want to look into this. Like you said, we have some time on our hands right now. I don't, I'm not a big like international basketball fan. Like I don't like really watching like all that stuff. Just more of an NBA guy. I love the lore, I love the history of it all, right? So why not watch some Antoine Walker? So I did some watching, and that's kind of the inception of this article.
Yeah, the fact that you just said the lore and the history of the NBA and it's all centered around Antoine is it's making me smile from ear to ear right now. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel here, but you're right, it's wild when you look back at some of the stats and you see, you know, Antoine was shooting for a 3-year period between 7 and 8 threes per game in the early 2000s. Like if you go back and watch those games, it's unimaginable. Some of those games didn't break 90 points. Most of those games didn't break, you know, 85, 90 points at different times. And so it is kind of crazy to think about. And then in the article, you kind of go into, you know, all aspects of Antoine's game, right? Because I think most noticeable or most memorable, people are going to say, oh, he was a chucker that just shot a lot of threes. But there was more to Antoine. There really was a lot more to his game. And even recently, we did a breakout video where I don't know if you saw on the Ryan Russillo podcast, he interviewed T-Mac. And T-Mac talked about tanking his Celtics interview in 1997, I believe, when Rick Pitino was the coach, because he didn't want to play for Rick Pitino. Celtics had 2 first-round picks that year. They went with Chauncey Billups and Ron Mercer instead. So, of course, we took a walk down, you know, what if territory of what if the Celtics had T-Mac to go with Antoine and maybe Paul Pierce. And, you know, in that, you know, we were talking about, man, Twan's game really would have translated probably a lot better to the modern game that you see today. And part of that is not just the 3-point shooting. And you talked about it. I think his passing was something that was super underrated. Can you talk about what you found going through the game tape about Antoine's passing?
Yeah. So, the very first game I watched was that famous, you know, Celtics comeback against the Nets, the one you can find on YouTube, right? So I watched that game first. And there was like a clip, you know, where I can't remember who was calling the game. I think Breen was one of the guys calling the game. But there's like a clip in there where they're talking about, you know, how Jim O'Brien says, and I have like, you know, I know, but coming into this, I knew what like the average person knew about Antoine Walker. Like he, you know, he took a lot of shots. He made some questionable decisions with some of those shots. You know what I mean? I knew, so like I just thought he was like a big goofball, right? And I hear Jim O'Brien say, they're paraphrasing what Jim O'Brien said, but they're like, he's like the smartest guy on the team. He's like our quarterback, this, and that. And I'm like, okay, just, you know, a lip service, right, to one of his star players. And I'm watching and I'm like, wow, that's a really nice pass. And then I look at Pierce miss a pass that's similar to that. And I'm like, and I keep watching. I'm like, oh, that's another nice read. And then I watch this play. I'm like, he makes a really good rotation. The thing is, he's just the way he's built. It's just he moves a little slowly, so he wasn't there in time. You know?
The eye test doesn't match with the body. Like, you know what you're seeing.
You can see him like pointing things out to guys. You can see him getting upset with his teammates because they did the wrong thing. And I'm like watching, like, damn, like this guy's like a really cerebral basketball player. Like, holy shit, would have thought, you know, because like the reputation that's kind of unjustly been attached to the guy, right? So from watching that, like again, passing is one of those things where that's really a good sign of like how much you see the floor, because like, you know, being able to read where openings are coming from, being able to kind of manipulate things the way you want them, those are all like telltale signs of like spatial awareness, court mapping, all this and that. And yeah, he's one of the, at that time, probably one of the better big man passers in the NBA. I'll say this, he's better when he can like he has the ball in his hands and he kind of stands still, survey the court, rather than like when he's in the open floor in transition, than when he's like dribbling through traffic, trying to make passes, because he didn't have like the best handle. So like when he was dribbling through traffic, he was kind of more focused on like maintaining his dribble. He was more worried about that than like being able to read the floor. Whereas when he was in transition, or when he was kind of like just in the post, like hanging out, like he could kind of scan out and like see his options and stuff. But that's kind of what I learned about his passing, but very, very underrated as a passer.
Yeah, and you had in the article, which is linked in the description, by the way, you know, you had a couple really great examples of his passing, which I thought it was even more perfect that they both ended in misses, because like I said, the 90s, early 2000s Celtics outside of Paul and Antoine was a little rough, but there's one where Kenny Anderson misses a layup, and then one where Tony Batiste fumbles the catch and then misses a mid-range jumper. So very reminiscent, very spot on for my memories of late 90s, early 2000s Celtic basketball. But you know, we talk about even his shot selection, right? And this is the part where you mentioned in the article, you kind of went through, you know, Jim O'Brien's philosophies as a basketball coach and kind of what that Celtics team was trying to do, where they were, I should say, excuse me, a little bit ahead of the time with how many threes that they were shooting. And they had a pretty average offense. But if you're going to have an average offense, you know, let's try to even the odds out with some math a little bit. And that's kind of where the Celtics fell. But I thought something that was interesting that I think, you know, people may not remember always is that, you know, you talked about with his shot selection. Of course, there were definitely some questionable shots in there, but it was typically, you know, his shots were coming off of passes. It wasn't him dancing like you would think of, you know, late 90s, early 2000s hot sauce or anything like that, you know, trying to go between the legs and then shoot off the dribble. It was typically within the offensive rhythm and, you know, off of either him sprinting in transition to the 3-point line, which you mentioned back in the day. It was him and Reggie Miller, maybe a handful of other guys that were utilizing what is now very common, that if you have a fast break 3-on-2, at least one, if not two of those guys are sprinting and stopping at the 3-point line as opposed to going directly in. So, you know, through that deeper dive of looking at his shot selection, you know, the efficiency was never quite there, but it feels like the shot selection maybe wasn't quite as bad as what maybe you would have thought it would have been going into this experiment.
Yeah. So I was watching an old game actually yesterday. It was a Chicago Bulls game. I think it was Doug Collins on the call. And he was saying, like, he was talking about John Starks because it was the year after Starks kind of had the rough finals, and you know how his kind of career started to collapse after that. But he was saying, like, John Starks is going through the worst possible thing you could have as like a basketball player. Like, he's thinking too much, right? And like, I think the cool thing about Walker, and it's like there's a trade off to it, but like Walker was like supremely confident. He never really hesitated. You know, you talk about .5 basketball today. He was always kind of like that ahead of his time. He wasn't like a really methodical like type player. Like, he did things like, you know what I mean? He played with a lot of conviction, I like to say, right? And so like the trade off to that is like, you know, he was a confident basketball player. So sometimes he took a couple shots where it's like, you know, probably not the best idea, but that's the trade-off. That's the tax you pay. And you talk about them having an average offense. The thing is, like, between O'Brien's understanding of 3 is greater than 2 and Walker's ability to, you know, take a bunch of threes, Pierce's ability to take a bunch of threes. I talk about this later in the article, but Walker was also able to play as a small ball 5. And what that did is it allowed them to put more offense on the floor and still have good defense. This team, if they weren't able to, like, they barely made it to being an average offense. Like, their personnel was like, if I didn't look through every team in the NBA that season, but they were like probably like bottom 5, bottom 7 offensive personnel in the NBA. But thanks to Walker's unique gifts, thanks to O'Brien's philosophy of shooting a lot of threes, they were able to juice the most they could out of that offense and get it to respectable, which in a weaker Eastern Conference, when you combined, like, you know, average, a little bit below average offense with high-end defense, that's enough to get you, what was it, 2 wins away from the NBA Finals?
Yeah, which is wild
to
think about.
Yeah, so like people will say like, yeah, Walker took a lot of shots. Well, Walker taking those shots was better than anyone else on the roster doing it, with the exception of Pierce. Like, who did you want taking those shots? Was it going to be Eric Williams? Was it going to be Tony Delk? Was it going to be Tony Battie? You know, like Rodney Rogers, whoever it was. Like, they couldn't take that many shots and be as efficient. It sounds funny to say as efficient as Walker. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to say like you could build an elite offense with Walker as your second best offensive player, but like, he was the perfect piece for what that Celtics team had going for them during that time. And like, he led them to great heights, which is an Eastern Conference Finals, albeit a weak Eastern Conference, but still, like, that's a good season most times when your team is 2 wins away from the NBA Finals. You are a good basketball team in most cases.
And the crazy part about that all is that, you know, as you were going through kind of their roster and the way that they were set up in the philosophy, that's in part what led them to be a little bit overzealous, because the reason Rodney Rogers and Tony Delk were on that team is because the Celtics traded away a little rookie named Joe Johnson, who might have been a good fit for the long term if they had waited that out just a little bit more. So it's funny thinking about how that philosophy probably influenced them getting a little bit too aggressive in the market with the young rookie. Something I'm curious to know is, do you think there is, you know, who do you think right in the modern NBA would potentially be a facsimile to Antoine Walker? Is there a guy out there? I struggled to really come up with one. I found a few maybe like statistical profiles, but game style, body type, it's really hard to find somebody. But I was curious if there was anyone that comes to your mind.
Yeah, so I'm going to be 100% transparent. As I was doing it, no, because I kind of talk about it in the article, but he's like, he's skilled like a modern big today, but he's built like a classical one. Like if you watch any time he was involved in a screen, it was rough to watch. Like you would like him navigating through a screen. Well, he didn't really navigate through it. He just kind of like collided with the dude and just like pointed at his guy to switch. That was another thing. He would always like. I feel like he was too trigger happy with the switches, like the calls for switches. So I couldn't tell if he was like lazy or that was like coach's orders, but
I feel like it's probably somewhere in the middle of probably a little bit of both.
He played an insane amount of minutes too. That's another thing that people don't understand. He played like 41, 42 minutes a game. So maybe if he only played 30, he would have given a little bit more effort into certain things on defense. But so I didn't have like one at the time just because he was so unique to me. But somebody mentioned it to me after the fact. It was one of the readers, said Julius Randle, and I actually really like that. I would say, yeah, I mean, similar like kind of classical body types. Randall's kind of built like a classical forward, but he has these more modern skills. He's pretty trigger happy.
Yeah.
With the jumper. Although I'll say I think Walker has better shot selection. I think Walker's a better passer, but I do think Randall probably better defender, better driver, more like of an on-ball scorer. But like similar, if you think about it, like probably similar standings within the league during their times in the league, I would actually say maybe Walker was the better player in his era at his peak than Randall. But I mean, we could quibble about that.
Yeah, I mean that's tough. I mean, Randall's just made 2 All NBAs in the last couple of seasons.
I also don't agree with either of those All NBAs or the
right. I mean, of course,
the All-Star nods.
It's interesting. I don't. Randall's probably not like he wouldn't be if if you're doing word association. Julius Randle, the first thing you're not going to think of is All NBA, right?
No,
but those things did happen. But I agree. I think that the profiles of who they are and who they're thought of as, right, especially for Toine really be between 98 and 03. That's kind of like where his peak lies. This would be that similar type arc to where Randall is today, with the Knicks, where that's why there's still those lingering questions. Well, if Randall's your best or second best player behind Brunson, however you want to look at it, I would definitely say Brunson's their best player, but it's like, what are you going to do with that? You know what I mean? Like, where do you get, and that's to your point where you said if Antoine's your second best guy and you're running a lot of your offense through him, I don't know, but obviously in today's era, there'd be a little bit more space. It would be a really interesting experiment to kind of see where Toine might fall. I'm curious, Matt, in your research for this article, did you have any either fun facts or anecdotes that maybe didn't quite make the article that you really enjoyed learning about in your research?
I mean, I kind of dropped some of them with like the thing where he liked to point switch a lot, when he probably shouldn't have. There's the one that everyone knows. I didn't actually explicitly say it in the article, but I hyperlink it where he talks about like, why do you shoot so many threes? Because there are no fours.
One of the greatest all-time NBA quotes. If you're making the top 5 list, it's got to be up there.
Pretty forward-thinking thought, honestly. Other fun facts. I mean, that passer rating stat I referenced, he was pretty high. I said he was in the 89th percentile that season, but he was always in like the high 70s, low 80s for his prime years. And that, here's one. This has nothing to do with Antoine Walker. And I know Celtics fans have a little bit of beef with this guy, considering what they had to give up to acquire him. But Rodney Rogers was actually kind of like ahead of his time. He was kind of like Walker.
I always liked Rodney. It was just the price. Yeah. I liked Rodney though.
Yeah, he was kind of like ahead of his time though, where it was like, pretty good shooter, could pass. But he was kind of built like a more classical forward. But yeah, I'm still kind of mad that I missed the mark on that Julius Randle one. I feel like that would have been a nice little pin drop, because once he said it to me, I was just like, holy crap, like how did I I don't even miss that.
Yeah,
How did I fumble the bag
and they
on
got the
that one,
Kentucky
you know?
connection as well too,
Yeah,
right? So you could have looped it together,
yeah,
in a couple of different ways. I'll say the one part of your article that I wish that there could have been a little bit more on is we got to talk more about the wiggle. I've been wiggling since I was 9 years old because of Antoine. It happens when I talk, so a lot of times on podcasts you just see kind of moving back and forth, and you know it's the Walker wiggle is something that was a staple of my childhood. So that's one thing I've always wanted to learn more about, is whether that was something that he just came up with on the spot, or if this was something that was predetermined. But that's perhaps maybe an article for a different day.
yeah. I'll say this. Again, like I did similar piece on Manu Ginobili, and I think both of these guys warrant like much greater investigation. Like I've been talking, you know, myself about getting into the YouTube space more, and if I was to do that, I think the video form would probably be a better forum for both of those guys to kind of explore that stuff, like maybe like a 10-15 minute video. Whereas in these articles, I was mostly trying to focus on like what makes them like kind of similar to players today back then. But yeah, no, that would be interesting. Little shimmy, wiggle. Those are cool. Those were really cool. I remember one game. I don't know, it was just always cool. Like when the Garden would get super hyped, and he was just like I said, he was super confident. It was awesome. He's an awesome player, man.
He knew how to play off the crowd. He was
Yeah.
definitely a showman and knew how to play off the crowd and get the crowd going. Well, Matt, I appreciate you joining me today, man. I really enjoyed the article. I enjoy all of your work. And for those of you listening right now that aren't familiar with Matt or not sure where his work is at, please give us a little rundown of where people can find your stuff.
I'm all over the place. So I think the best thing to do would just be follow me on Twitter at Mat Issa 15. That's at MATISSA 15. I usually tweet out the work I'm doing, tweet out just random stuff. I don't tweet anything anymore. I guess I X whatever.
Right? It still doesn't flow. It doesn't sound right.
I'm gonna call it Twitter forever.
I think we all are.
I don't care what you have to say, Elon. But yeah.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you stopping by here, man. It's been a pleasure. Anytime I can talk about Antoine Walker, I'm going to take the opportunity to do it. So appreciate you stopping by, brother.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, man.